Ladies and gentlemen, tonight, I want to talk about something that exists far beyond headlines, far beyond the polished surface of interviews, far beyond the carefully curated images that shape public perception. I want to talk about what happens in the spaces no one sees. Behind the achievements, behind the powerful innovations, behind the extraordinary stories of success and ambition, when the people closest to someone decide to speak, not as critics, not as enemies, but as human beings who live through a shared reality. Their words carry weight, not because they are scandalous, but because they are human. And that is what we're here to explore: what happens when people who were once part of someone's most intimate, private world decide to break their silence. We live in an age where silence can be more powerful than words. It can create myths, shape narratives, and build entire legends out of half-truths and carefully chosen fragments. But when that silence ends, the world gets something far more valuable than sensational headlines. It gets a glimpse into the raw, unfiltered, emotionally complex truth of being human. And that truth, as uncomfortable as it may be, is where the deepest lessons live. In the world of science, we often talk about cause and effect, about systems, about the intricate and sometimes unpredictable interactions that shape outcomes. Human relationships are no different. They are ecosystems, dynamic, shifting, influenced by pressure, by expectation, by personal dreams, and by the invisible weight of the world's gaze. When someone lives at the intersection of power, innovation, and relentless global attention, that ecosystem becomes not only complicated, but often volatile. The private lives of public figures are rarely truly private. Their partners, their families, their children, their ex-spouses, all become unintentional participants in a story that the world feels entitled to narrate. But the reality inside those walls is never as simple as the headlines. Behind every photograph that looks perfectly staged is a heartbeat, a breath, a hesitation, a late-night conversation that never made it into the press. When those who once shared that private space choose to speak, it isn't just gossip, it is testimony, it is memory, it is the residue of love, ambition, fear, resilience, and survival. And to understand it, we must strip away the celebrity lens and look at it through the lens of human neuroscience, emotional dynamics, and the psychology of power. When someone is driven by vision, when their mind is wired to push boundaries, when their brain operates in states of hyper-focus that most people rarely experience, everything else, including relationships, is touched by that state of being. The neural circuits responsible for reward, ambition, and creative problem solving can overshadow the circuits responsible for attunement, emotional mirroring, and deep interpersonal connection. This isn't about good or bad, it's about wiring. The same neural mechanisms that drive extraordinary innovation can also make it difficult to fully inhabit the emotional landscape of those around us. In neuroscience, we often see this paradox in individuals who operate at extremes. Their capacity for visionary thought is immense, but their emotional bandwidth can be stretched thin, not because they lack feeling, but because their brains are occupied by a mission so consuming that everything else becomes peripheral noise. Now imagine being the person standing next to that. Not the public standing at a distance, admiring the brilliance, but the partner who has to navigate that inner world every day. The partner who sees the nights of silence, not because there's anger, but because the mind next to them is orbiting somewhere else entirely. The partner who wakes up knowing that their presence is real, but not always prioritized. That is the reality many spouses of high-functioning, mission-driven individuals face. They don't live with the icon. They live with the human beneath it. A human who is at once extraordinary and flawed, capable of world-changing ideas but sometimes struggling with the simplest emotional gestures. In private, what breaks relationships in such worlds isn't usually betrayal or explosive fights. It's emotional starvation. It's the quiet erosion of connection. The brain, after all, is wired for attachment. We are biologically designed to seek attunement, that subtle dance of gaze, tone, timing, and touch that tells us we matter. When that dance goes missing, when it's replaced with endless hours of work, relentless pursuit of a mission, or an emotional distance disguised as focus, the nervous system of the partner begins to adapt, first with patience, then with doubt, then with pain, and eventually with silence. Silence isn't the absence of words, it's the absence of being felt. And when that happens for too long, even the strongest love begins to fracture. This is why when ex-spouses finally speak, they often don't sound angry. They sound tired. Not tired in the trivial sense, but in the deep, cellular way that comes from years of carrying invisible weight. They describe not grand betrayals, but quiet voids. They talk about feeling like ghosts in their own homes. They speak of conversations that happened in whispers, while the rest of the world celebrated. These testimonies matter because they reveal the cost of greatness. Not as a judgment, but as a fact of human neurobiology. The human mind cannot operate at the edge of innovation, and at the center of emotional intimacy, with equal intensity forever. One eventually begins to dim so the other can shine. And unless there's a deliberate, conscious intervention, a choice to build emotional bridges as carefully as technological ones, something breaks. When individuals build rockets, electric cars, or reshape industries, the world watches in awe. But no one sees the quiet dinner tables where someone else sits waiting. No one hears the heartbeat of the person lying next to them at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling, wondering if love has become a shadow of an idea. And here's where science gives us profound insight. Emotional attunement is not a luxury in relationships, it's survival. When partners feel unseen, the limbic system, the emotional brain, begins to register it as a threat. Cortisol levels rise. The body enters a low-grade stress state. Over months and years, this becomes chronic. It leads to fatigue, anxiety, and a quiet erosion of identity. Many partners of powerful, mission-driven figures describe feeling like they disappeared, slowly, invisibly, while the world kept clapping for the other person. And then, when they finally speak, people mistake their words for bitterness. But beneath those words is a more universal truth. The human soul does not thrive in absence. It does not flourish in emotional deserts, no matter how luxurious the surroundings may be. It's easy to romanticize genius, to put brilliance on a pedestal and assume everything around it is illuminated. But genius casts long shadows too, and those who love it most often live inside those shadows. I've spent years studying how high-achieving individuals structure their lives, and the neuroscience of attachment has taught us something extraordinary. Love is not sustained by words alone, nor by intention alone. It is sustained by presence. And presence is not measured in hours spent together. It's measured in the quality of attunement between two nervous systems. A glance can hold more weight than a speech. A hand on the back can speak louder than an award ceremony. But when the brain is wired to orbit around ideas that change the world, those small moments are the first to go, not because they don't matter, but because they seem so small compared to the vastness of a mission. Yet, ironically, those tiny moments are what keep the human soul alive. That is the paradox. The world sees a visionary. The partner sees a distance. The public sees brilliance. The partner feels absence. And when they finally break their silence, the truth that emerges isn't a weapon. It's a map of what happens when extraordinary ambition meets the fragile architecture of human intimacy. In one private account I came across during my research, a spouse described nights that stretched into silence like long corridors. She said, "It wasn't that he didn't love me. It was that his love lived in another galaxy. And every time I reached for him, I felt like I was touching light years away." That isn't bitterness. That is a human describing what it feels like to orbit a star that burns too brightly to hold. And so, when the world hears the phrase, breaking their silence, it shouldn't rush to judgment. It should pause and listen. Because these voices are more than stories. They are data. They are lived evidence of how human relationships bend under the gravitational pull of world-changing ambition. Every person who has ever loved someone who belongs more to their mission than to their home understands this. They understand the strange loneliness that can exist in a shared bed. The feeling of sitting next to someone whose body is present, but whose mind is elsewhere, building, dreaming, solving. That is the story behind the silence. Not scandal, not betrayal. Just two nervous systems trying to survive on different frequencies. And as we explore these testimonies further, it becomes clear they are not only about one individual. They are about us, about what happens when ambition outgrows intimacy, when the human heart tries to keep pace with a brain that's running at the speed of invention. When I listen to the quiet truths hidden behind those testimonies, I don't hear gossip. I hear the echoes of something almost universal. The way love and ambition often walk in opposite directions, trying desperately to hold hands. You see, in the architecture of human relationships, emotional safety is not built on grand gestures. It's built on micro moments. The small, almost invisible signals that say, I see you, you matter, I'm here. But when the tempo of a life moves at a velocity far beyond the ordinary, when one person is constantly immersed in high-stakes problem solving, in relentless forward motion, those micro moments become casualties of momentum. A partner may not even realize when it starts happening. At first, it's just one missed dinner. Then it becomes a pattern of being emotionally half-present. Eventually, what used to be connection begins to turn into cohabitation. Two people living side by side, breathing the same air, but inhabiting different worlds entirely. This is not unique to any one story. This is a pattern that neuroscience recognizes. When individuals operate in what we call hyper-goal orientation, the brain becomes selectively attuned. Dopamine circuits, which normally light up in response to shared human connection, start to recalibrate around achievements, milestones, and visionary pursuits. It's not that the love goes away. It's that the brain begins to prioritize stimuli differently. Imagine standing next to someone whose eyes are always fixed on the horizon. You can love them deeply, but you will eventually feel invisible if they never turn toward you. Over time, that invisibility begins to shape a partner's nervous system. The vagus nerve, which governs feelings of safety and social connection, starts to fire less frequently. Oxytocin, the bonding hormone that strengthens attachment, begins to decline. And slowly, the sense of starts to dissolve into you and me. What's extraordinary and heartbreaking about this process is how silent it is. There is rarely a dramatic moment of collapse. Instead, it's erosion, gradual, patient, like water wearing down stone. A spouse may go years before finding the words to name what's happening. And when they finally do, it often sounds less like accusation and more like confession. They say things like, I didn't stop loving him. I just stopped existing in his world. Or, I realized I'd spent years learning to adapt to a person who didn't even notice my adaptation. That kind of language isn't rooted in hatred. It's rooted in the deep grief of emotional disconnection. There's also a profound psychological layer to this. Loving someone whose life is larger than life means becoming, in some way, a supporting character in a story the whole world is watching. You are not just in a relationship with the person. You are in a relationship with their legacy, their mission, their public image, and that creates an asymmetry that can be crushing over time. Human beings are wired to need reciprocity, not perfectly balanced but felt. When one person is orbiting a global mission, the other often finds themselves anchoring the private space, the home, the emotional hearth, the invisible structure that makes the mission possible. And while the world celebrates the one in the spotlight, the one in the shadows slowly becomes transparent, not because they lack value, but because their labor is emotional, and emotional labor is often unseen. In the field of effective neuroscience, we talk about invisible work, the quiet, relentless emotional scaffolding that one partner builds so the other can fly. That scaffolding is made of patience, of forgiveness, of adapting to late nights, of learning to love in absence. But even the strongest scaffolding eventually creaks. And when that happens, silence turns into words. When ex-spouses finally speak, they rarely start with the big moments. They start with the little ones. The missed eye contact at a dinner table, The conversation that turned into a monologue about work. The way laughter became rarer, not because love vanished, but because it had no room to breathe. These are the threads that hold and unravel human bonds. But what makes these stories so important is that they shine a light on something society rarely talks about: the emotional cost of genius. Not in the person who carries the ambition, but in those who love them. We live in a culture that glorifies brilliance, that worships disruption and power and vision. But we almost never ask what happens to the people standing behind that brilliance, watching it burn so brightly that it casts them into darkness. In many accounts from former partners of powerful figures, there's a recurring phrase: "I didn't recognize myself anymore." That's not a poetic line. That's the neurological consequence of chronic emotional undernourishment. When your attachment system doesn't receive consistent signals of safety, the brain begins to down-regulate identity. You start to measure your worth by proximity to someone else's mission. And when you finally step out of that orbit, the first thing you have to do isn't heal from betrayal. It's rebuild your own reflection. This is where psychology becomes personal. Many partners who leave relationships with high-functioning, ultra-focused individuals go through something very specific: a silent identity withdrawal. They have spent so long adapting to someone else's gravity that, when they finally step away, they feel weightless. But not in a liberating way. In a terrifying way. It's like learning to breathe in normal air after years of breathing in vacuum. The nervous system has to rewire itself. This process is often misunderstood. Outsiders see strength in the one who speaks out. They see a sharp, articulate person telling their story. But what they don't see is the quiet night after the interview, when that person sits alone, trying to remember who they were before the orbit began. This is why their silence matters. It is not just their story. It is the story of countless people who have loved someone whose dreams were too vast to hold them close. There is another layer, a scientific one, to this. Research in interpersonal neurobiology shows that high-functioning, high-stress individuals often develop adaptive detachment. This isn't coldness, it's survival. When your mind is perpetually engaged in solving problems of massive scale, it learns to minimize emotional noise. Emotional noise isn't noise at all, it's human connection. But in the brain of someone trained to filter distractions, love itself can start to feel like static. And this is the most tragic paradox. The very wiring that allows someone to change the world can also make it nearly impossible for them to stay fully tethered to another heart. For the partners, this often means living with someone who seems both incredibly close and impossibly far. They can touch their skin, hear their voice, share a bed, and still feel as though they're trying to hug a beam of light. They love a person who is always slightly elsewhere. When they speak about this later, they rarely do it with anger. They do it with a quiet clarity that comes from years of watching something slowly slip through their fingers. I've spoken to psychologists who specialize in this dynamic, and they say something striking. It's not about being unloved, it's about being unanchored. That distinction is vital. Love can exist in abundance, and yet a relationship can fracture because it was never grounded. Love without anchoring is like wind through open hands, beautiful, powerful, and impossible to hold. And so, when the silence breaks, what emerges isn't just truth about one person's private life. It's a mirror held up to the tension between greatness and closeness, between legacy and love. If you look back through history, the pattern repeats itself. Innovators, disruptors, visionaries, they build worlds, but the people who love them often had to live in those worlds without being fully seen. It's not new. What is new is that more people are finally speaking about it openly, without shame. This shift matters. Because when we talk honestly about the human cost of ambition, we create space for future visionaries to build differently, to learn emotional fluency alongside technical brilliance, to recognize that a mission that changes the world does not have to cost the quiet intimacy of home. But for that to happen, society must stop treating the words of former partners as gossip and start treating them as data. These stories aren't scandal. They're science. They're psychological evidence of what happens when intimacy tries to coexist with relentless forward momentum. And maybe, just maybe, if we listen more deeply to these stories, we might help future relationships survive where past ones cracked. Because what's being revealed when silence breaks is not just a personal history. It's a human blueprint, one written in nervous systems, in emotional patterns, in nights too long and voices too quiet. I remember one account vividly. A woman described her years as the spouse of a visionary. She said, "I loved him like gravity, but gravity doesn't apologize for pulling. It just pulls." She didn't sound bitter. She sounded like someone who had finally stopped floating and found the ground beneath her again. There's something profoundly instructive in that, because it shows us that love alone isn't enough when you're loving someone who belongs to the sky. And so we return to this moment, this global fascination with the stories of ex-spouses who choose to speak. Some people will consume these stories for drama, but the wiser ones will hear the deeper layer. This is about emotional survival, about the neuroscience of attachment, about the human cost of dreaming too big without remembering to look back. And perhaps most importantly, it is about silence, not as weakness, but as something sacred. When silence breaks, it's not just speech. It's reclaiming breath. It's reclaiming self. When we think about silence breaking, we often imagine it as a loud, sudden event, a confession, a headline, an explosive interview. But in truth, most silence doesn't break like glass. It softens, it trembles, it releases slowly, like a breath held for too long. For many who speak out after years of standing in the orbit of an extraordinary life, the act isn't about revenge. It's about reclamation. It's about stepping out from the gravitational pull of someone else's destiny and finally feeling the sun on their own skin again. That moment isn't glamorous. It's vulnerable. It's shaky. It's often accompanied by a strange, quiet fear, because silence can be a cocoon. And once it breaks, the world begins to listen. But listening is not the same as understanding. To truly understand what's being said in these testimonies, we need to look at them through the lens of what makes us human, the neural dance between love and self, between devotion and identity, between belonging and becoming invisible. In healthy relationships, there's a rhythm, a give and take, a flow between autonomy and togetherness. Both partners breathe in and out of that rhythm. But when one person becomes the axis around which the world seems to spin, that rhythm can get disrupted. One breath becomes heavier than the other. One voice grows louder, not through arrogance, but through scale, through the immensity of their mission. The partner begins to shrink their own voice. At first, it's subtle. They tell themselves it's temporary, that this is what it means to support someone extraordinary. But months turn to years, and soon their own laughter, their own dreams, their own sense of place starts to dim. In neuroscience, there's a term for what happens in long-term relationships where one nervous system consistently overrides the other emotional entrainment. The quieter partner's emotional state begins to synchronize with the dominant rhythm. They learn to keep themselves small to keep the peace. They minimize their needs to avoid being in the way. And after long enough, they stop hearing their own voice altogether. This is why, when silence finally breaks, the sound isn't loud. It's unfamiliar. It's the sound of someone relearning their own name. And it's important to note, the person whose orbit they lived in isn't always a villain. In many cases, they didn't intend to silence anyone. They were simply consumed by an idea, a mission, a vision so enormous that it devoured their bandwidth for anything else. This isn't cruelty. It's human limitation. But limitation doesn't erase impact. It doesn't undo the emotional cost. And this is where we, as a society, must evolve. We must stop glorifying the myth of the untouchable visionary and start teaching the art of emotional reciprocity as an integral part of greatness. Because brilliance without presence isn't wholeness, it's imbalance. I've sat with people who described the moment they realized the relationship was over not because they stopped loving, but because they could no longer bear the silence. One woman described it like this: "He was talking to the world, but he hadn't spoken to me in years." That sentence has haunted me, because it's not about cruelty. It's about forgetting to come home. Coming home is not a physical act. It's an emotional one. It's when someone decides to turn their attention, not their body, not their reputation, but their attention, fully, deliberately, toward the person who has been waiting to be seen. That is the currency of connection, not wealth, not power, not brilliance, attention. And in these stories, attention was the rarest currency of all. When we elevate individuals who live in the rarefied air of world-changing missions, we often forget to ask, who built the air they breathe? Who kept the home breathing when they weren't there? Who waited through nights when genius replaced intimacy? Those are the people whose silence eventually speaks, and their voices are not footnotes. They are the missing chapters of the story. This is also where the science and the soul meet. Neuroscience tells us that consistent emotional neglect, even unintentional, has physiological consequences. Increased stress hormones, disrupted sleep patterns, a sense of hypervigilance that makes it hard to rest, even in love. Over time, it doesn't just break relationships. It reshapes the body itself. That is why when these individuals speak years later, there's awareness in their voices that no headline can capture. It's not the wariness of one breakup. It's the wariness of a nervous system that carried too much for too long. We need to stop romanticizing that pain. We need to stop treating the silent partner as a supporting character. We need to understand that behind every extraordinary figure, there is often an extraordinary silence. And that silence isn't a void, it's a person. A person who loved deeply. A person who adapted endlessly. A person who finally remembered they had a voice of their own. I remember another account from someone who had spent years beside a visionary. She said, "It's not that he didn't love me. It's that his love never had a landing strip. It just circled above me, waiting for a moment that never came." That line is not just poetic. It's neurological truth. Love, when not embodied in presence, never lands. And a love that never lands eventually feels indistinguishable from absence. This is why listening to these stories matters so profoundly. They're not gossip. They're maps of how ambition shapes intimacy, how human connection bends under pressure, how even love, something as powerful as love, can falter when the rhythm is no longer shared. And yet, there's a strange and quiet beauty in this too. Because breaking silence is not just an act of ending. It is an act of beginning. It's the beginning of selfhood. The beginning of someone stepping back into their own light after years of orbiting another. When these individuals tell their stories, they're not just recounting what went wrong. They are reminding the world what matters. That in the end, it's not genius that keeps two people together. It's attention. It's the small moments. It's the shared breath at the end of a long day. And this, perhaps, is the lesson buried deep inside these confessions. Greatness is hollow if it can't hold closeness. For those listening today, especially those who live inside the orbit of extraordinary lives, I offer this truth not as criticism, but as a quiet challenge. Look back. Turn your gaze, even briefly, toward the people who love you quietly. Do not let brilliance blind you to their existence. Do not let the horizon make you forget the ground beneath your feet. And for those who have loved someone like that, for those who have lived in silence for years and are just now learning how to speak again, know this: your voice is not too late. Your story is not too small. Your truth is not an afterthought. It is part of the architecture of greatness itself, because no legacy is whole without the stories of those who held the space behind it. So when the world hears these voices now, the voices of those who once lived beside brilliance and were never fully seen, I hope it doesn't just hear scandal. I hope it hears the human heartbeat inside the noise. I hope it understands that what's breaking isn't just silence. It's history. It's balance. It's the quiet demand that love must be felt, not just spoken about. And in that moment, maybe we will all start to build differently, dream differently, love differently, not smaller, but truer, not quieter, but more present. Because in the end, what endures is not the noise of genius. It's the steady heartbeat of those who refuse to disappear. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the real story behind the silence.